The drill sergeant's first order was not an order. It was a demonstration. He walked into the barracks bay at the Veth'Kaan Military Institute and threw a live flashbang into the center of the room. The cadet nearest to it, a Goroth clawfighter twice the mass of any human, grabbed it, absorbed the blast, and hit the floor with all 6 of his legs folded wrong. 16 other cadets scattered. 2 ran for exits that had been locked 20 minutes ago. 1 froze completely and stood in the middle of the concussion ring with his bioluminescent crest blazing white, which meant, in Goroth color language, that he was dying of embarrassment. Only Corporal Maren Voss, the single human in the intake cohort, freshly transferred from a mid-rim colonial constabulary, wearing the cheapest issue boots Veth'Kaan stocked, picked up the second flashbang. The sergeant had already rolled under the bunk row, looked at where it was going to detonate, and stepped 1 meter to the left. The drill sergeant's name was Threx. He had 4 arms, each ending in a 3-pronged manipulator that could seal into a fist the size of a field ration crate. His exoskeletal thorax plating was the color of old iron. His mandibles, when he clicked them together twice in rapid sequence, produced a sound that cadets quickly learned meant disapproval. He clicked his mandibles twice. Then he looked at Voss and said, in clipped galactic standard, "You, report your name." "Voss," she said. "Maren Voss." "Your record says constabulary, frontier posting." "Yes, sir." He studied her with all 4 eyes, the upper 2 independently tracking. "Why did you step left?" "The acoustics in this room are terrible, sir. When you came in, I was already tracing the ambient resonance decay from the first flashbang. The bunk rail on the east side creates a channel. Anything rolling under row 3 goes to the same place." Another double click. But he filed the information somewhere behind those 4 eyes and moved on. That was the first day. The training arc would last 8 months. 3 years after that day, on the Veth'Kaan Forward Deployment Zone, designated Corridor 7, Voss was lying prone behind a collapsed ferrocrete wall while 6 Veldrani infantry units tested the structure's sightlines with precision fire. She had 4 squad members left alive in her position and 211 civilian personnel in the transit hub 300 meters behind her, waiting on evacuation lift ships that were 11 minutes out. Between her and the civilians was a bridge. 1 bridge, 3 spans, load-rated for medium cargo, currently occupied by roughly 140 meters of open air and no cover whatsoever. She pulled up the tactical uplink on the screen, strapped to her left forearm, and ran the numbers for the 4th time in 2 minutes. She got the same answer she had gotten the 3 previous times. The lift ships needed to reach the transit hub. The transit hub had 1 access road. The access road crossed the bridge. The Veldrani were going to own the bridge in 7 minutes unless something convincing stood in their way. Corporal Voss pressed her back against the ferrocrete and looked at her 4 remaining squad members. There was Cadet, now Sergeant Threx, Goroth species clawfighter, the same one who had absorbed that first flashbang on day 1. He had been rebuilt and reclassified at the Institute 2.5 times over the subsequent training. He could seal that 300-meter open bridge crossing in 40 seconds if he had suppression cover. There was Specialist Verwin, Helian species, triple-jointed limbs, the fastest marksman in their cohort, able to hold 800-meter focus even with compromised atmospheric pressure. There was Private Keith, a Goroth younger, experienced, but with the instincts his training had sharpened, and Private Sella, a Helian female who had graduated 4th in their intake class and spent 3 years proving the ranking was wrong in her favor. And there was Voss. "Threx," she said, "how long can you hold the mouth of the bridge if I put you there?" His upper arms flexed. The bioluminescent panel at his throat pulsed amber. "Against 6 units? Not long." "Verwin, what's your angle on their forward advance team?" "Degraded. They're using the building on the northeast corner. I can punch through the west-facing window on the 3rd floor, but I need a minute to range lock, and if they shift, I lose it." "They'll shift," Sella said. "Veldrani flanking doctrine. They always shift at 1/3 advance." Voss nodded. She had written the same note in her tactical field journal 6 months ago after studying Veldrani engagement patterns on the Institute's simulation library. She had then rewritten the same note again on a different day, when it stopped being academic. 8 months of training, 3 years of application. She looked at the bridge. The third week of training at Veth'Kaan, Threx had ordered the full cohort into the integration chamber. The integration chamber looked like a gymnasium designed by something with too many ideas. The floor panels were individually programmable. They could tilt, drop, extend spikes, deliver electrical feedback, or drop temperature to levels that were medically inadvisable. The ceiling hung with various obstacles at various heights. The air could be thinned or thickened. 17 cadets entered. Threx told them they were going to run a standard cross-terrain team exercise. Then he turned off the lights. In the dark, the Goroth cadets managed adequately. Their thermal sensitivity compensated. The Helian cadets managed poorly. Their main sensory apparatus was visual. Two of the others, species Voss, had not yet learned to classify properly, went completely stationary, which Voss understood as a fear response. Voss fell down twice, got back up twice, and navigated primarily by memorizing the floor map during the 30 seconds of light before it cut off. Threx watched on the infrared feeds. When the lights came back on, 16 of the 17 cadets were standing in varying configurations around the room. The 17th, a Helian named Perth, the one who had frozen, was sitting on a lowered floor panel near the northeast wall, which was the warmest part of the room, and which meant, Voss reasoned, that he had found it by sensing heat rather than navigating. Threx clicked his mandibles 4 times. How many of you knew where the exit was? 3 hands went up. One of them was Voss's. How many of you knew where the rest of your team was? No hands. You were a team in name, Threx said. You were 17 individuals in a dark room in practice. Tell me why that matters. He looked at Voss again. He did this frequently. She had not yet decided whether it was because she was the only human in the cohort or because she kept answering questions in ways that interested him. Because in the field, Voss said, "You don't get lights." A pause. His upper right manipulator tapped his own thorax plating once. She learned later this meant he was filing information. Correct. Because in the field you do not get lights, you do not get thermal feeds, you do not get air you can breathe without a mask, and you do not get terrain that holds still. You get what you bring in here. He pressed the same manipulator against his own thorax, then pointed it at the room. What you have in here. What you have in here when the room takes everything else. The training methodology became clearer after that. Threx was not interested in performance under good conditions. He was not particularly interested in strength or speed or native sensory capability, though these mattered at the margins. He was interested in what cadets did when conditions stopped cooperating, which conditions, in his experience, always eventually did. The first cadet washed out in week 4, a Goroth who was physically extraordinary but who locked up under the combined stress protocols. Threx did not express disappointment. He struck the name from the intake manifest with 3 precise keystrokes and told the remaining cohort, 16. You will make fewer mistakes when there are fewer of you to coordinate. He was right, technically. He was also wrong, because what he could not account for was that the 16 who remained had watched one of their own leave, and that had changed them. Voss had seen it happen before, not at a military academy. At the frontier colony where she had worked constabulary, where people died of accident and isolation and the kind of slow attrition that planetary outposts specialized in. The survivors of those events moved differently afterward. They checked exits when they walked into rooms. They memorized the names of the people who worked shifts adjacent to theirs. They noticed, when a piece of equipment failed, that it was that piece and not some other piece. Because failing equipment had patterns, the patterns were survivable if you were paying attention. 8 months of training. The Institute wanted soldiers. Threx wanted something more specific and harder to define, and Voss was not sure he knew what he wanted until she showed him. Week 11, the outdoor course. 52 kilometers of terrain that the Veth'Kaan Institute's Landscape Engineering Division had specifically altered to be inhospitable. Not impossible. Impossible was a waste of resources. Inhospitable. Enough friction to sort candidates. The ground was dry clay substrate over a subsurface that had been seeded with irregular collapse zones. Not everywhere, not predictably, but often enough that cadets who moved at full pace without testing footholds went through the surface crust and hit the soft layer beneath. The drop was about 60 centimeters, enough to twist an ankle, enough to cost time. 4 cadets went through the crust in the first 3 kilometers. 3 of them were able to continue, 1 was not. The one who was not, a Helian named Kess, who had been consistently in the top third of the cohort, sat at the bottom of the hole where she had fallen and looked at her right lower limb, where the landing had bent the joint past what Helian anatomy preferred. The course rules were clear, no assistance from other cadets. If you fell, you extracted yourself or you called for a medical pickup, which ended your course run and required a full requalification. Voss was 40 meters ahead when Kess went through. She heard the crumble sound of the crust giving way. She stopped. She looked back. The rules were clear. She also did the calculation. Kess had scored consistently high on the range exercises, on the navigation protocols, on the cross-species communication drills that had been added to the curriculum after Kelthras's darkroom session. What Kess had not scored high on was the physical terrain elements, because Helian physiology was calibrated for environments with more even ground, and that was a liability that training could only partly compensate. The rules were clear. The rules were also not the same as the decision. Voss went back. She got Kess out of the hole. She did not carry Kess that would have violated the letter of the protocol, and she had no interest in technicalities as a loophole. She braced the limb, talked Kess through this extrication, and then told her, "Can you finish?" Kess looked at her. "The rules say, 'Can you finish?'" Voss said again. Flat, not harsh. Kess finished. So did Voss, 3 minutes behind her personal pace target, which knocked her from the top of the daily standings to 4th. Kelthras reviewed the course footage the following morning. He called Voss to his office, which was a small compartment that smelled of field kit oils and something organic she could not identify. He showed her the footage. He said nothing for a long moment. "I'm aware of the rules," Voss said. "You broke no rule," Kelthras said. "You chose to slow down. The rules did not require you to speed up." "I know." She thought about this. She had been thinking about it since yesterday. "Because in 8 months I'm going to be in the field with the people in this cohort. And on the field, they are going to be my assets, or they are not. A trained person who has been through this course with me is an asset. A trained person who washed out on the terrain portion and had to requalify is a diminished asset, because she knows she has a ceiling I witnessed. And I need my assets without ceilings." She paused. Also, it was the right thing to do. 4 eyes. All 4 focused on her simultaneously. His mandibles clicked, not twice, not 4 times, once. She learned later this meant something closer to acknowledgement than any other sound he made. "You will lead your squad," he said. "Not because of your scores, because of that." He reassigned her squad leadership status 2 days later. She had not requested it. The training deaths came in month 5. The Institute's survival trial, a standard 72-hour immersive exercise, in the northeastern sector, which was classified as a Grade 3 hostile environment, went wrong at the 38-hour mark when a weather system that the forecast models had assessed as low probability came through ahead of schedule. The temperature dropped 60 degrees in 40 minutes, which was survivable for most of the species present but which moved the exercise parameters from Grade 3 to Grade 5 without the atmospheric warning that should have preceded it. 2 cadets died, both Gorath, both succumbing to the same cascade failure. Their thermal regulation systems, which were excellent under standard conditions, hit a feedback loop when the external temperature plunged too fast. Their biology simply could not adapt in time. A 3rd cadet, Perveth, the Helian who had found the warm wall in the dark room months before, was found in acute distress and airlifted for medical support. He survived but did not return to the cohort. The exercise was suspended. The survivors assembled in the main hall. Kelthras stood at the front of the room and said, 14. That was all he said. The memorial that the Institute conducted was brief and formal. After it ended, Voss went back to her quarters and sat on the bunk for a while. She did not cry. She had known the Gorath cadets as cohort members, not as anything closer, and the grief was real, but not shattering. What she felt, more precisely, was the weight of the number 14. 2 months ago it had been 17, then 16, then 15. Each reduction was a calculation that training had made, the course self-selected by attrition, and attrition was a value judgment embedded in the curriculum. Some candidates would not make it through, and the system accounted for this, and this was by design. The design was not cruel. It was functional. The grade of the forces that graduated the Veth'Kaan curriculum was extraordinarily high precisely because the curriculum demanded extraordinarily high performance under conditions that approximated imperfectly but genuinely what the actual deployment environment would ask for. 2 of the 14 who remained had been in that weather event when it turned fatal. They had survived because they made decisions quickly enough. That was what the system was designed to sort for, and it had sorted correctly, and 2 of their cohort were dead. Voss understood all of this. She understood it on an intellectual level that was thorough and professionally adequate. She still sat on the bunk for a while. The following morning she was the first one in the training yard, on the bridge at Corridor 7 with the evacuation liftships 9 minutes out and the Veldrani advance unit 4 minutes from reaching them. Voss made her decision. It was not a complicated decision. It was the decision that the math produced. She needed the bridge held for 9 minutes. She had 5 people, of whom 2, herself and Threx, could operate at the bridge mouth under direct fire without dying immediately. Verwin's range ability was the squad's most valuable tactical asset. Putting him in the direct fire line was wasteful. Keith and Sella were capable but not seasoned enough at close quarters pressure to anchor a position against a professional advance unit. "Here's what we're doing," she said. She laid it out. 45 seconds, no ceremony. "Verwin, you're moving to the elevated position at the transit hub's northwest corner. From there, you can range the Veldrani advance team through the northeast building's window before they shift. You get 1 shot at that window before they move. Make it count." "Understood." "Keith, Sella, you're backguarding the civilian access corridor. If anything gets past me and Threx, it hits you. Nothing reaches the transit hub." Both of them looked at her and understood what she was not saying. "Me and Threx take the bridge mouth." Threx's amber panel pulsed. He said nothing because there was nothing to say. 9 minutes, 5 people, 1 bridge. The Veldrani advance team crested the approach to the bridge 2 minutes ahead of Voss's estimate, because Veldrani commanders who were good at their jobs never moved on schedule. Voss had anticipated this, which was why she had added 2 minutes to her own estimate and not told anyone. Voss and Threx took the bridge mouth at a dead run. Threx hit the first suppression position and unfolded. Gorath Anatomy, under fire, produced a fighting platform that was approximately 600 pounds of armored exoskeletal mass with independent arm function. He occupied the mouth of the bridge like a wall. The Veldrani advance team, which had expected to walk into an empty crossing, hit that wall and lost momentum for 11 seconds. 11 seconds was a long time. Voss moved left. She always moved left when the acoustics were bad, when the geometry demanded it, when the instinct her training had sharpened down to reflex told her that left was the answer. She came around the bridge railing and hit the forward element of the Veldrani unit from the angle they had not covered, which was the angle she had identified when she memorized the bridge layout 40 minutes before anyone started shooting. 6 minutes. Verwin's single shot through the northeast building's window hit true. The Veldrani advance team's coordination fractured when their ranged support went down. Sella's voice came over the unit channel, controlled and flat, rear corridor clear, 4 minutes, Threx was hit. Not critically. Gorath physiology was absorptive, and what would have killed a human or a Helion, Threx cataloged as structural damage and continued to operate. His left upper arm was compromised. He shifted his fighting posture, rebalanced, continued. 3 minutes. The Veldrani were good. They were working a flanking solution even as the bridge mouth held. Voss saw it developing in the geometry of their movement, the same pattern Sella had named, the 1/3 advanced doctrine that she had read in the simulation library and then read again the day it stopped being academic. She had 2 options: hold the current position and lose the flank, or give up the bridge mouth position and counter the flank, which meant the Veldrani would have the crossing in 90 seconds. 2 minutes and 20 seconds. She chose to hold. The Veldrani flank broke against Voss at the eastern railing. She had been there 30 seconds before they arrived, because she had known it was coming, and she was already set when they crested the railing edge. The fight at the railing was close and brief and cost her the ability to use her left arm for the rest of the engagement. Threx held the mouth. 1 minute and 40 seconds. 1 minute. The first lift ship's running lights showed over the transit hub's roofline. Then the second. Then the third. Voss heard the civilian boarding calls start. The transit hub's speaker system, calm and procedural, directing 7 cohorts of civilians to their allocated ship. 211 people. She had not known most of their names before today. She knew the number. The number was the same as what the math produced, which was the same as what the training had prepared her to calculate and act on. 40 seconds. The Veldrani unit fell back to regroup. They were professionals. They would adapt. They would come back with a different approach, and when they did, the position at the bridge mouth would be insufficient, and the math would produce a different answer. The lift ships were loading. The loading was fast. Someone at the transit hub had run the math too, had known that fast boarding was the variable they controlled, and had drilled it. 20 seconds. The third lift ship lifted, then the second. The first was still loading. The Veldrani came back. 3 years earlier, in month 7 of training, Kelthros had run the cohort through what the curriculum called the final integration exercise, which the surviving cadets called by a name that was not printable in official documentation. The exercise lasted 11 days. It combined every assessment type the curriculum used: physical endurance, navigation, team coordination, individual decision-making under stress, cross-species communication under degraded conditions, into a continuous flow scenario that did not stop for sleep or weather or the preferences of anyone involved. By day 5, the cohort of 14 was running on significantly inadequate rest and operating in conditions that the curriculum designers had calibrated to approximate the cognitive state that accompanied the 4th day of a sustained field deployment. Their decisions slowed. Their coordination degraded. 3 of them made navigational errors, serious enough to require course corrections that added 4 hours to their transit time. Voss did not make the navigational errors. She did make a different error in day 8, when she called a wrong assessment of a simulated civilian contact situation, and her squad lost 17 minutes recovering from the misidentification. She sat with that for approximately 2 minutes, then updated her situational model and kept moving. Kelthros, reviewing on day 9, said to his assistant instructor, "She adapts in real time." The assistant, a Gorath academic with 4 degrees in military pedagogy, said, "Her species does. Their pattern recognition under sustained cognitive depletion is anomalous. The sleep deprivation effects present differently. Their decision-making does not degrade the same way." "I know," Kelthros said. "You anticipated it." "I was curious how she would use it." A pause. "She uses it correctly." The exercise ended on day 11. 14 cadets completed it. Not all of them completed it intact. Threx had a stress fracture in his lower left limb that the medical team addressed immediately after extraction. Verwen had lost most of his acute vision in his secondary eyes, which were the ones that handled close-range detail work, and needed 6 days of treatment before full restoration. Voss had completed with a deep cut along her forearm from a simulated terrain obstacle that had been not quite simulated enough, and with the score profile that the Institute's assessment engine flagged with a notation she was not shown until graduation, which read, "Anomalous tactical adaptation under sustained stress. Recommended senior field assignment. Monitor for independent command potential." Kelthros walked the length of the formation after the exercise ended. He stopped in front of each cadet for 3 seconds and said nothing. He reached Voss and stopped for 5 seconds instead of 3. Then he said, to the formation generally, "You are soldiers." It was the only time in 8 months he used the word without qualification. The last lift ship lifted with 9 seconds remaining. Voss heard the engine roar change pitch as it cleared the transit hub's roofline and pushed for altitude, and she knew from the pitch that it was loaded and climbing, which meant all 211 civilians were on it, or one of the ones that had already gone. The Veldrani unit reached the bridge mouth. Threx was still there. He had been there the entire time. He was still there because he had decided to be there, which was a decision his training had prepared him to make precisely as clearly as it had prepared him to do anything else, and he made it without hesitation. Because hesitation was a thing the training had removed from him, carefully and with purpose over 8 months and 3 years. Voss called the retreat order. She called it at the last moment, not before. The difference between the last moment and the moment before it was that the last moment was the one at which the bridge was no longer necessary, and the moment before it was the one at which it still was. They ran. Left was the answer again, because left was where the cover ran, and left was where the route Voss had mapped, and left was where the evacuation corridor opened up 300 meters from the bridge. Threx ran with her. He was slower than he had been, his structure was compromised, and the Veldrani had made their assessment of him and acted on it. He ran anyway. They crossed 260 meters. At 270 meters, Threx went down. Voss turned around. She did the calculation. She had done this calculation in the Institute's simulation room, in the outdoor course, in the integration chamber, and on the 11-day exercise. She had done it the day she went back for Kess on the terrain course, and she had understood, even then, that there would come a time when going back was not the answer, when the calculation would produce a different result, when what her training had built in her would be required to hold the position even when the position felt wrong. The number was 211. The bridge was clear. The lift ships were climbing. Voss went back. She did not think about whether it was strategic. She knew it was not strategic. She thought about Threx in week 1, absorbing the flashbang and hitting the floor with his legs folded wrong, and the dark room, and the terrain course, and day 9 of the final exercise, and Kelthros standing in front of her for 5 seconds instead of 3. She thought about what her training had built, and what it had cost, and what it had produced, and she went back because going back was the decision. The same way stepping left at the beginning had been the decision, not because the math required it, but because the math was not the only thing. Running, she got Threx moving. The Veldrani unit was 40 meters behind them. At 310 meters, the evacuation corridor doors sealed behind them, and the corridor's blast shielding engaged with a sound like a continental shelf settling into place. The Veldrani stopped at the corridor entrance. Their advance was over. Voss and Threx were on the ground in the corridor, both of them breathing in the manner of people who have been running on the far side of their capacity for an extended time. Keith was there. Sella was there. Verwin was there, all 5. After a moment, Keith said, "The number?" Voss looked at him. 211, he exhaled. Sella's secondary eyes were closed. Verwin put his forehead against the corridor wall, briefly, for reasons that were his own. Threx made a sound that, in Gorath physiology, was the sound of a structure assessing its own damage and determining that the damage was within the category of things that heal. "Still standing," he said, in Galactic Standard, to no one in particular. Voss looked at the sealed corridor door. On the other side was the bridge they had held, the approach they had defended, and a Veldrani unit that had learned something about human squad leaders today. She thought about Kelthros in his small compartment that smelled of field kit oils, reviewing footage on a screen. She thought about what he had said to her, "You will lead your squad, not because of your scores." She thought about what the training had cost and what it had built, and whether those were separable things. The corridor's emergency lighting was pale and even and cast no dramatic shadows. The 5 of them sat in it and breathed. After a while, Voss reached into her field kit with her working arm and pulled out the tactical uplink and checked the lift ship feeds. All 3 had cleared the engagement zone. All 3 were transmitting normal status. 211, she put the uplink away. She leaned her head back against the corridor wall. Threx said, "Kelthros would have said it was adequate." Voss almost smiled. He would have clicked his mandibles once. "Yes," Threx said, "he would have." The corridor held them. The corridor was quiet. Outside, the Veldrani were doing what professionals did after a failed advance, regrouping, reassessing, redeploying with an adjusted plan. Inside, 5 people sat in the pale emergency light and did what the training had built them to do in the space after a thing was finished. They sat still. They did not celebrate. They checked their assets. They assessed their condition. They prepared to move. That was what 8 months produced. That was what 3 years of application paid for. In the simulation room at the Veth'Kaan Military Institute, in the outdoor course over dry clay substrate in the 11-day exercise where nobody slept and everyone adapted, the curriculum had asked a specific question repeatedly. in different forms, and under different conditions. The question was, what do you do when everything stops cooperating? The answer, it turned out, was this. You do the calculation and then you go back. You hold the bridge mouth until the last moment. You step left when the acoustics are bad. You give up your scoring position to brace a teammate's limb on a terrain course because in the field they are an asset and assets do not have ceilings. You carry the number. You make the decision. The training had not made them into people who were good at those things. The training had revealed that they already were. Threx had told the formation on the final day of the integration exercise, "You are soldiers." He had said it without qualification, which Voss had understood to mean that the qualification was assumed and no longer needed to be spoken. She had filed that information on the same day she filed the assessment notation she had never been shown but which she had understood was there, because certain kinds of evaluation were legible from the outside if you were paying attention. She was always paying attention. That was not a thing the training had given her. That was a thing she had brought in from the frontier, from the colony constabulary, from years of watching failing equipment and memorizing exit routes and learning the names of people who worked adjacent shifts. The training had given her a language for it, a structure, a set of people who understood the same language and could move in the same structure. What the training had cost was the same as what it had built. You could not separate the price from the product. The attrition was not incidental to the quality. The attrition was part of the mechanism that produced the quality. You could wish it were otherwise, and the wishing changed nothing. 2 dead cadets in a weather system that moved too fast. A third pulled out on medical. A fourth who had never been able to go forward from the dark room. The Gorath claw fighter, who locked up under combined stress, who had been physically extraordinary and had been struck from the manifest with 3 precise keystrokes and who Voss had never stopped thinking about. What remained was what was sitting in this corridor. 5 people who could hold a bridge for 9 minutes against a professional advance unit and bring all 211 civilians out the other side. That was the answer the training produced. That was what the cost had bought. Threx's structure was assessing its damage. Keith was checking his field kit. Sella had opened her eyes and was running the same tactical uplink feed Voss had checked, running it again not because she doubted the result, but because checking twice was what the training built. Verwin's forehead was no longer against the wall. Voss looked at all 4 of them. She looked at them the way Threx had looked at her in that small office with the field kit smell. All 4 eyes focused simultaneously, taking measurement, finding nothing that needed correction. She said, "We'll wait for the all clear and then move to the secondary extraction point. Threx, you move with me." "Yes," Threx said. Sella, ready. Verwin, ready. Keith, the youngest of them, looked up. He was still new enough that some of the cost had not fully arrived yet, and she could see that in him, and she did not try to accelerate it. The cost arrived on its own schedule. "Ready," Keith said. Voss checked the corridor door. It was holding. Outside, the Veldrani had moved on, because the objective was gone, and professionals did not waste time on positions that no longer served the objective. She pulled up the extraction route on the tactical uplink, pale blue lines on a gray map, clean, clear, navigable. She had memorized it 40 minutes ago, the same way she had memorized the bridge layout, the same way she always memorized everything she might need in the dark. When the lights went out and the room took everything else, and all you had left was what you had brought in with you. The corridor's emergency lighting hummed. They waited, they breathed, they prepared to move. That was enough. That was exactly enough. The all-clear came 47 minutes later, in the form of a command net ping that Voss had to decode manually because the standard decryption key had been rotated during the engagement and the auto-update had not pushed through to their field terminals. She decoded it in her head, using the rotation table she had memorized at the start of the deployment, because she had noted, reviewing the unit's field protocols, that the auto-update system had a historical failure rate of 22% under combat load conditions. The kind of thing nobody had thought to brief her on. The kind of thing she had found by reading the maintenance logs. She confirmed the ping, confirmed the extraction route was uncontested per the updated tactical overlay, and stood up. Her left arm had stiffened. She moved it carefully until it was functional again, which took approximately 90 seconds and was not pleasant. "We move," she said. The secondary extraction point was 800 meters with maintenance cars that ran under the district's primary power infrastructure. The corridor was low-ceilinged for Gorath anatomy. Threx moved at a slight crouch the entire distance, his upper arms held close, his bioluminescent panels dimmed to near nothing for light discipline. He did not complain about the ceiling. He had never, in Voss's experience, complained about any environmental constraint. He cataloged them and adapted. This was a thing the training had built, and also a thing that had been in him before the training, and after 8 months and 3 years she had stopped trying to separate the two. Keith took the rear position without being told. He kept the interval clean, not too close to be caught in a single event, not too far to lose contact. He checked the corners before he moved through them. He used the corridor wall's thermal differential to orient in the dimmed light. Voss watched this happen without comment, because commentary was for training sessions, and this was not one. The Veldrani were not in the corridor. The Veldrani were also not entirely gone from the district. The tactical overlay was showing movement in the parallel surface roads, which meant they were reorienting rather than withdrawing. Professionals did not withdraw from unachieved objectives. They adjusted. This adjustment would eventually produce another approach vector, and when it did, whoever was holding the secondary extraction point would need to be ready. Voss filed this and kept moving. Month 3 of training. The communications protocols. Kelthros had brought in a specialist from the Veth'Kaan Communications Division, a Helian with extremely long, secondary fingers and a manner that suggested she found the cadets somewhat beneath her assessment interest, which Voss privately thought was probably accurate. The specialist ran the cohort through the Galactic Standard Field Communication Protocols, which were extensive, and through the cross-species tactical shorthand libraries, which were more extensive, and through the emergency encoding tables, which were most extensive of all. The Gorath cadets absorbed the tactical shorthand rapidly because Gorath communication architecture was naturally suited to compressed signal formats. The Helian cadets absorbed the Galactic Standard Protocols rapidly because Helian phonemic processing was calibrated for multi-layered information streams. The other species in the cohort absorbed at varying rates according to their native processing architectures. Voss absorbed all three simultaneously at a rate that caused the specialist to pause at the end of the first day and review her assessment scores in silence for a moment before moving on. The second day, the specialist ran an encoding drill. The cadets were given a set of field condition parameters and asked to encode a tactical assessment using the emergency tables. Standard completion time for the drill was 22 minutes. Most of the cohort completed it in 18 to 25 minutes, which was the expected range. Voss completed it in 9 minutes. The specialist checked the answer. She rechecked it. She said nothing to Voss directly. She moved on. After the session, Kelthros spoke with the specialist privately. Voss was not present, but she was adjacent, moving through the corridor outside his office with her field notes, and the office walls were thin, and Gorath mandible click acoustics carried. The specialist said her encoding structure is non-standard. Kelthros said, "I know. She's using the rotation table as an index rather than a key. It's technically correct, but it's a method that isn't in the curriculum. She derived it herself. Almost certainly the output is correct. The process is faster. If she's taught the standard method, it will probably slow her down." A pause. "Do not teach her the standard method." Another pause. "You're going to let a cadet operate outside protocol?" "I'm going to let a cadet operate more effectively than the protocol requires." Kelthros said, "This is not the same thing." Voss filed this in the same category as the step-left moment and the office visit about the terrain. Course. Not because it flattered her. Because it told her something about what Kelthros was actually trying to build. He was not trying to build uniformed soldiers. Uniformed soldiers were a product of a different curriculum, and they were useful for a different kind of war than the wars the Veth'Kaan graduates were expected to fight. He was trying to build something more specific, people who operated at maximum efficiency within their own architecture, whatever that architecture was. The curriculum was the common framework, the minimum shared language. what you brought to it, and what you made of it that was your own. That was the differentiated product. Voss had brought 9 years of frontier constabulary work, a native facility for environmental pattern recognition, and the specific cognitive adaptations that came from spending years in situations where the official protocol was written for conditions that did not match the actual conditions. She had gotten good at the gap between the protocol and the reality because the gap was where the actual problem always lived. The training formalized that. It gave it a uniform and a rank in a squad. Month 5's deaths had formalized something else. She had gone to see the memorial registry the day after the formal service. The Institute maintained a physical registry, not a digital record, not a network entry, but an actual physical document on a material that would outlast the building in the entrance hall. The names were added by hand by the Institute's commandant using a specific tool that Voss had observed but could not identify by material. The notation was in Galactic Standard and in the species' native script, side by side. Voss stood in the entrance hall and read the 2 new names. She read them carefully, the same way she read everything. Not to process information, but to make the information real, to anchor it in memory in a way that kept it from becoming abstract. The Gorath cadets had been named Kethrak and Vorsen. Kethrak had been the one who initially partnered with Threx in the navigation drills, the one who had the thermal sensitivity that had gotten him through the dark room without falling down. Vorsun had been quieter, had communicated primarily through the bioluminescent panels rather than the standard vocalization channels, had scored highly on the cross-species awareness assessments because of this, an ability to read biological signal rather than verbal signal that was, the assessors noted, unusually refined, both gone in a weather event that had not been flagged as serious. Voss stood at the registry for a while, then she went back to the training yard. The remaining 14 cadets had a navigation drill scheduled at 0630, and the navigation drill required preparation. This was the answer she had worked out, in the time between the bunk and the training yard, to the question of what training deaths meant. Not an answer that resolved the grief. Grief was not a problem with a solution, it was a condition with a duration. An answer to the question of what to do with it, which was, file it, carry it, and make the work it was supposed to produce. The Gorath who had washed out in week 4, the physically extraordinary one, the one who had locked up, had not died. He had washed out, which was categorically different and better in every respect that mattered. He was alive somewhere, in a capacity the training had correctly assessed him for, doing work that matched his capabilities. The curriculum had not killed him, it had redirected him. The weather event had not redirected anyone. It had simply subtracted. Voss carried both numbers, the subtraction and the redirection. She carried them because that was the answer she had worked out, and because carrying them was what kept the numbers from becoming statistics. They reached the secondary extraction point at the 0200 mark. The point was a hardened subsurface platform that the district authority had built 3 years ago as part of an infrastructure upgrade that had, incidentally, provided one of the best armored fallback positions in the district. Voss had identified it on the tactical map 4 days before the current engagement when she was still doing pre-deployment area assessment. She had added it to her field notes as a third-tier fallback option and had briefed Threx on it at the time, on the assumption that if things went badly enough to need a third-tier option, she might not be the one making the call. The platform held a communications array, field medical supplies, and emergency power, no additional personnel. The district authority's contingency plans had assumed that extraction from this point would be self-directed, which suited Voss fine. She sat Threx down in front of the medical supplies and assessed his damage. Gorath physiology did not present damage the way human physiology did. There was no blood, because Gorath's circulatory architecture was sealed under the exoskeletal plating, and there was no swelling, because the plating itself constrained swelling. What there was, instead, was a specific sound, a faint vibration at frequencies she could feel in her hand rather than hear, when she pressed the compromised areas. The exoskeletal plates were cracked in 2 places along his left upper arm assembly and 1 place along his thorax. These were structural injuries. They were not immediately life-threatening, and Threx's biology was already beginning the process of calcification around the damage, which was the Gorath equivalent of clotting. He would need a proper repair facility within 48 hours to prevent the calcification from setting in a suboptimal configuration. She told him this. He said, "I know." Then, after a pause, "You did not have to come back." "I did," Voss said. "The math did not require it." "No," she said. "The math had already cleared. The bridge was done." She taped a brace around his left upper arm assembly using the medical supplies on hand, which were not designed for Gorath anatomy, but which were better than nothing. The math wasn't the only thing running. Threx watched her work. His amber panel pulsed slowly at the rhythm that meant something she had learned to read in month 2 of training as functional contentment. It was not the same as happiness. Gorath did not index happiness the same way. It was closer to the assessment of a system that was operating within acceptable parameters, which, given that his left arm was cracked in 2 places and his thorax in 1, was either optimistic or a sign that his baseline for acceptable parameters was calibrated differently from hers. She suspected it was the latter. 8 months of training and 3 years of field application had recalibrated everyone's baselines. That was, in some ways, the point. The communications array at the extraction platform was running on emergency power. Voss spent 20 minutes establishing contact with the command net, routing through 3 relay nodes because the primary was still showing intermittent dropout, and filing the post-engagement status report that the chain of command would require before they would authorize the full extraction. The report was 7 fields. She filled them accurately. When she reached the field that asked for civilian personnel accounted for, she typed 211. She submitted the report and waited. The reply came back in 4 minutes, which was faster than the chain of command usually moved, and which meant someone at the command level had been watching the engagement feeds in real time. The reply was 3 lines. First line, report received. Second line, extraction authorized. Third line, well done. Voss stared at the third line for a moment. Then she closed the uplink. Keith, who had been sitting adjacent and not asking questions, said, "Good news?" "Extraction authorized." He exhaled. It was a sound that contained several things at once: relief and the aftermath of sustained fear, and also a kind of quiet recalibration that Voss recognized as the moment when the body understood that the emergency was over. She had felt it herself many times, in the constabulary years, in training. It never felt exactly the same twice, which she thought was probably correct. The emergencies were never exactly the same, so the relief should not be either. "How long?" Keith asked. The report said 40 minutes. He nodded. He sat back. He looked at the ceiling of the hardened platform and said nothing for a while. Sella was working on her own field notes, which she kept in a physical format, an actual notebook, polymer paged, that she carried in her chest kit. She had started the habit in training, month 2, after a session in which the digital recording systems had failed under the environmental conditions and several cadets had lost 2 days of assessment notes. Sella had lost none, because she had already started the physical backup. Voss had noted this at the time and had started her own physical backup the following week. It was the kind of adaptation that spread through a cohort naturally, without anyone making a protocol of it. The notebook was almost full. 3 years of field notes in a format that would survive the conditions they operated in. Voss had gone through 4 notebooks herself. She kept them in the kit bag in her quarters. She was not sure why she kept them. They were not required for any official purpose. She kept them for the same reason she had gone to read the names in the memorial registry. Because the numbers needed to be real, and real things had weight. Verwin was running a calibration sequence on his weapon system, which he did after every engagement. Voss had observed that this was not standard post-engagement protocol. Standard protocol specified a calibration sequence within 24 hours, not immediately after, but she had never directed him to stop. His accuracy scores were consistently at the top of their unit. Whatever he was doing with those calibration sequences, the results justified the habit. 40 minutes. The extraction team would arrive in 40 minutes. Voss thought about the next deployment cycle, which was scheduled to begin in 18 days, and which the post-engagement report would now factor into. Command would reassess their unit composition in light of the current engagement losses. They had started Corridor 7 with 9, and they were sitting at 5, and Command would want to understand the 4 to 5 attrition rate before reassigning them. She already knew what the assessment would find. The 4 who had not made it to the extraction platform had been lost in the first contact phase, before the bridge had become the objective. In the chaotic initial engagement, when the Veldrani had established their advance faster than the district's early warning system had flagged. In that initial contact, the losses had been a function of position and timing rather than decision, the kind of loss that the training had taught her to classify as tactical volatility rather than avoidable error. She would say exactly that in the debrief. She would say it flatly, in the same tone she used for field reports, without elaboration. She would not make it sound acceptable. She would not make it sound more terrible than it was. She would carry the 4 names the same way she carried Veth'Kaan Voss, and she would go back to the training yard, metaphorically, now, literally, for Keith and for whoever Command assigned to fill the unit's gaps. That was what 8 months and 3 years built. Not a way to stop loss, not a way to make the numbers smaller, a way to carry the numbers and remain operational, a way to carry the numbers and make the bridge hold. That was also what it cost. The extraction team was a pair of light transport units, smaller than she had expected, which meant Command was running the extraction lean, which meant resources were tighter across the zone than the briefing materials had indicated, which was information she would add to her field notes and carry into the next cycle. She got everyone on the first transport. Threx's structural damage made the boarding process slower than standard. The transport's entry configuration was not designed for compromised Gorath anatomy, but they managed it in 9 minutes and 30 seconds, 3 minutes 30 over standard boarding time. She filed that number too. The transport lifted. Through the transport's optical feed, Voss watched the district fall away below them. The ferrocrete wall she had used for initial cuff hover, the bridge, the transit hub. The transit hub was dark now. No civilians, no boarding calls over the speaker system. 211. She turned away from the feed and looked at her squad. Threx was calibrating his sensory array with his working arm, running a damage assessment that would take most of the flight time. Keith had his eyes closed, not sleeping, she knew from his posture, just processing. Sella was writing in her notebook. Verwin was already running the mission debrief framework in his head. She could tell by the way he was staring at nothing, which was the same expression he wore when he was range locking on a target through a window, 800 meters away, 4 people. In 18 days, Command would add names to the list. She would learn those names, the same way she had learned every name, the same way she had read the names in the registry. She would make them real before they had the chance to earn a place in that registry, because that was the work. The transport hummed. The district lights below organized themselves into the recognizable grid of a functioning city, still lit, still running, because the bridge had held, and the civilians were elsewhere, and the Veldrani advance had not reached the hub. Voss leaned her head back and closed her eyes. Her left arm ached in a way that would need attention at the medical bay. Her boots, not the cheapest issue ones anymore, she had earned better 3 years back, had taken damage at the heel on the eastern railing. She would need to requisition a replacement pair. Small practical things, the texture of continuing. She thought about Kelthros in the entrance hall on the last day of training, walking the length of the formation, stopping 3 seconds in front of each cadet and saying nothing, his mandibles, for once, still. She had understood that silence differently then than she understood it now. Then it had been the silence of a finished assessment, a completed evaluation. The curriculum done with this cohort, the product delivered, the file closed. Now she understood it differently. Not a closing silence, a held breath. The pause before everything the training had built would begin to be tested by conditions that the curriculum could approximate but never fully replicate, because the real conditions included the specific pressure of the specific moment in the specific place where the specific number was at stake. He had stopped in front of her for 5 seconds instead of 3. She still did not know precisely what that had meant. She had her theory. The theory was that he had seen in those 5 seconds that she was going to take the numbers seriously, that the 211s of the actual deployment were going to be, for her, real, not statistics, not tactical variables, but real. She hoped that was right. She chose to believe it was. The transport broke through a cloud layer and the city below disappeared, and they were in the dark above it, running lights off for the first segment of the flight path, navigating by instrumentation. In the dark, Voss was the same as she was in the light. That was what the training had confirmed, and what she had brought into the training as a raw fact from 9 years of constabulary work on a frontier that did not go easy on anyone who needed the lights. She breathed, she waited, she prepared to do it again. That was enough, that had always been exactly enough.